In 1992, my neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Red brick houses lined up perfectly with well-kept gardens and mailboxes that looked like soldiers in formation. It was a neighborhood where kids played baseball in the street until the sun went down, and where the sound of the ice cream truck was the soundtrack of summer. Roger Smith lived 3 houses down from mine, in a 2-story house with blue shutters that his wife Martha had painted the previous summer. I was 7 years old when I met him, and to me, Roger was like that cool uncle everyone wants to have. He was a robust man, thick but strong build, with a thick mustache that was always perfectly trimmed. His brown eyes sparkled when he smiled, and believe me, he smiled a lot. Roger was a long-distance trucker, but not the lonely type you'd imagine. He was the soul of our neighborhood. Saturday mornings you'd see him washing his navy blue Peterbilt in the garage, whistling some country song while his son Tommy, barely 5 years old, helped him with a tiny hose. Martha would always come out with fresh lemonade, and soon half the neighborhood was there, chatting about the weather, sports, or weekend plans. But what really made Roger special was his past as a baseball player. In his living room, he had a wooden display case he'd built himself, filled with golden and silver trophies from his glory days. The most prized was a tall, shiny trophy with a batter figure on top, the 1978 National Amateur Baseball Championship Trophy. Roger had been the captain of the Chicago Hawks team, and that trophy represented the proudest moment of his life. When my father worked double shifts at the factory, Roger always offered to drive me to school in his red pickup truck. During those 15-minute rides, he'd tell me stories from the road about places he'd seen, people he'd met. His voice was warm and comforting, like hot chocolate on a cold winter morning. March 15th, 1992. Started like any other day. Roger got up at 5 in the morning, as he always did before his long trips. I saw him from my bedroom window as he loaded his coffee thermos and travel bag into the Peterbilt. Martha came out in her robe to say goodbye, and Tommy ran barefoot across the wet grass to give him a goodbye hug. Roger's route that day was supposed to take him through Route 66, delivering auto parts to a warehouse in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was a familiar route for him, one he'd driven dozens of times before. He always called Martha around lunchtime from whatever truck stop he'd found along the way. That day, the phone never rang. By 6 in the evening, Martha was pacing in her kitchen, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Roger was religious about his schedule. He'd always be home by 4:30 for his afternoon snack, usually a ham sandwich and a glass of cold milk, while he told Tommy about his day. The empty chair at their kitchen table seemed to grow larger as the hours passed. I remember watching from my window as Martha walked to the end of their driveway, shielding her eyes from the setting sun, looking down the street as if Roger's truck might appear at any moment. Tommy pressed his small face against the living room window, his breath fogging the glass as he waited for his daddy to come home. The police were called the next morning. Officer Martinez, a family friend, took the report with the kind of gentle professionalism that told you he'd done this before, but hoped he was wrong. Roger's truck was found 3 days later, abandoned at a rest stop near Flagstaff, Arizona. The keys were still in the ignition, his coffee thermos half full and still sitting in the cup holder. His wallet was there, his clothes, even the family photo he kept taped to his dashboard. But Roger was gone. The investigation stretched on for months. Search teams combed the desert around the rest stop. Volunteers from our neighborhood drove to Arizona on weekends, posting flyers with Roger's picture on every telephone pole and storefront window. Martha's sister came to stay, helping with Tommy while Martha spent her days on the phone with investigators, following up on every lead, no matter how small. I watched our neighborhood change during those months. The Saturday morning gatherings around Roger's truck stopped. Martha's garden, once perfectly maintained, began to show signs of neglect. Tommy stopped playing baseball in the yard. The sound of children's laughter seemed muted, as if the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for news that never came. The most heartbreaking part was watching Tommy grow up without his father. Every Father's Day, every birthday, Every baseball game at school where other kids had their dads cheering from the stands. Martha did her best, but you could see the weight of being both mother and father wearing on her. She aged years in those first few months after Roger disappeared. Christmas that year was particularly hard. Martha put up a tree, but it felt hollow, like going through the motions of normalcy when nothing was normal anymore. Tommy left cookies out for Santa, but also left a note asking for his daddy to come home. I remember my mother crying quietly in the kitchen after she read it. The investigation eventually went cold. Detectives moved on to other cases. The volunteers stopped coming. The flyers faded and were taken down or covered by newer announcements. But for those of us who knew Roger, the questions never stopped. What happened to the man who never missed his afternoon snack? Where was the neighbor who taught half the kids on our block how to throw a curveball? Years passed, and slowly, painfully, life began to move forward. Martha eventually returned to work at the local library. Tommy grew up, graduated high school, went to college. But Roger's absence was always there, like a shadow that followed the family everywhere they went. His empty chair at the dinner table was eventually moved to the garage, but the space where it used to sit remained vacant, as if the house itself was still waiting for him to come home. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. A dive team was dispatched to the area where Bill had found the trophy. What they discovered changed everything we thought we knew about Roger's disappearance. 30 feet below the surface of Lake Mead, they found the remains of a 1985 Ford sedan. The car was completely submerged, covered in decades of sediment and algae. Inside were 2 sets of human remains and several personal items, including Roger's wallet, his driver's license, and a small metal lunchbox that Martha had packed for him that final morning. The car had been there for nearly 3 decades, hidden beneath the dark waters of the lake, far from Route 66 where Roger was supposed to have been traveling. I called Tommy in California as soon as I heard the news. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, and I could hear the sounds of his own family in the background. His wife calling to their kids, the television playing some cartoon. Normal life sounds that made what I had to tell him seem even more surreal. "Tommy, it's about your dad," I said, and immediately heard the change in his breathing. After 28 years, those words still had the power to stop time. When I told him what had been found, there was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him moving away from his family, probably stepping outside or into another room. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "After all these years, we finally know." The forensic investigation took several weeks. DNA testing confirmed that 1 set of remains belonged to Roger. The second set belonged to Marcus Rivera, a name that meant nothing to me at first. But as the investigation deepened, a story began to emerge that none of us could have imagined. Detective Collins called me on a rainy Thursday afternoon to explain what they had discovered. Marcus Rivera had been the captain of the Detroit Tigers amateur team in 1978, the same team that Roger's Chicago Hawks had defeated in the national championship. I remembered Roger mentioning that game, how close it had been, how the other team's captain had been devastated by the loss. But I never imagined that defeat would fester into something so dark and consuming. "We've been going through old records," Detective Collins explained. After losing that championship, Marcus Rivera's life fell apart. His baseball career ended, his marriage dissolved, and he struggled with depression and anger for years. He blamed Roger for everything that went wrong in his life. The detective paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. In 1992, Marcus was living in Arizona, working odd jobs and nursing his resentment. When he learned that Roger was a trucker who regularly traveled through the area, he saw his opportunity for revenge. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Marcus had been watching Roger's routes, learning his schedule. He'd approached Roger at that rest stop near Flagstaff, probably claiming to recognize him from their baseball days. Roger, being the friendly, trusting man he was, would have been happy to reminisce about old times with a fellow player. What happened next we could only piece together from evidence and educated guesses. Marcus had somehow convinced Roger to leave his truck and drive with him to Nevada. perhaps claiming he wanted to show him something or make amends for their past rivalry. Maybe he said he had other teammates nearby who would want to see Roger. The car found in Lake Mead belonged to Marcus. Both men had ended up in that car, at the bottom of the lake, taking their final secret with them. Tommy flew back to Chicago for the first time in 5 years. I picked him up at O'Hare Airport, and the drive back to our old neighborhood was filled with a heavy silence. He looked older than his 33 years. The weight of growing up without a father etched in the lines around his eyes and the way he carried his shoulders. We met at the cemetery where Martha was buried, standing beside her simple granite headstone as we tried to process what we'd learned. The spring air was cool and cherry blossoms from a nearby tree drifted down like snow around us. I used to imagine he'd just walked away, Tommy said, staring at his mother's grave, that maybe he'd started a new life somewhere, that he was happy. I know that sounds crazy, but it was easier than thinking something terrible had happened to him. I understood what he meant. Sometimes the unknown is kinder than the truth. For 28 years, there had been room for hope, for possibility. Now there was only finality. Your mother never stopped believing he'd come home, I told him. Even at the end, when she was sick, she'd still look toward the door whenever she heard a car in the driveway. Tommy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm glad she didn't have to know. She died still hoping. The funeral was held on a crisp Saturday morning in April, exactly 1 month after the trophy had been found. Roger's remains were laid to rest beside Martha's, finally reunited after 28 years apart. The service was small but meaningful. Neighbors from the old days, some of Tommy's childhood friends, and a few of Roger's former trucking buddies who had driven in from neighboring states. Tommy spoke at the service, his voice steady but his hands shaking as he held the recovered trophy. The metal was still stained from its years underwater, but someone had carefully cleaned off the algae and sediment, revealing the engraved words that had meant so much to his father. My father always said that winning wasn't about beating someone else, Tommy said, looking out at the small gathering. It was about being the best version of yourself, about playing fair and treating people with respect. He lived that way every day, and that's how I want to remember him. After the service, as people were leaving, Tommy handed me the trophy. The weight of it surprised me, heavier than I remembered from all those times I'd seen it in Roger's display case. I want you to have this, he said. You knew him as well as anyone. You remember who he really was, not just how his story ended. I tried to protest, but Tommy shook his head. I have my memories of him. I don't need an object to remember my father, but this trophy, it should be with someone who understands what it meant to him. In the weeks that followed, more details about Marcus Rivera emerged. Detective Collins had been thorough in her investigation, and what she uncovered painted a picture of a man consumed by bitterness and resentment. After the 1978 championship loss, Marcus had struggled to find his place in the world. Baseball had been his identity, his future, and when that door closed, he couldn't find another one to open. His teammates from the Detroit Tigers remembered him as increasingly angry and obsessed with that final game. He would replay it over and over, convinced that the umpires had been biased, that the Hawks had somehow cheated. He never got over it, said Frank Morrison, who had played second base for the Tigers. The rest of us moved on. We got jobs, got married, started families. But Marcus, he was stuck in that moment forever. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been arrested several times in the 1980s for minor crimes: theft, assault, disturbing the peace. He'd served short jail sentences and had been in and out of counseling programs. Court records showed a pattern of someone spiraling downward, unable to cope with disappointment and failure. In 1991, a year before Roger's disappearance, Marcus had been arrested for stalking a former teammate who had gone on to coach high school baseball. The charges were eventually dropped, but the incident showed that his obsession with the past was escalating into dangerous behavior. Detective Collins found evidence that Marcus had been tracking Roger's trucking routes for months before the disappearance. He'd called Roger's company multiple times, claiming to be an old friend trying to reconnect. He'd even visited truck stops along Route 66, asking other drivers if they knew Roger Smith from Chicago. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Detective Collins explained to me during one of our conversations. This was planned, calculated. Marcus Rivera spent months preparing for this. The most chilling discovery came from Marcus's apartment in Arizona, which had been searched after his disappearance in 1992, but hadn't been connected to Roger's case at the time. Among his belongings, investigators had found newspaper clippings about the 1978 championship game, photos of the Chicago Hawks team, and a notebook filled with angry writings about Roger and the other players. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before Roger's disappearance, read, "He took everything from me. My future, my dreams, my life. Time to balance the scales." The case officially closed in June 2020, with Marcus Rivera posthumously charged with Roger's murder. It was a strange kind of justice, delayed by nearly 3 decades, delivered to a man who could no longer face the consequences of his actions. Tommy came back to Chicago one more time that summer, bringing his wife and 2 young children to see where their grandfather had lived. We walked through the old neighborhood, and I showed them the house with the blue shutters, told them stories about their grandfather's kindness and generosity. His daughter, who was about the same age Tommy had been when Roger disappeared, asked me why the bad man had hurt her grandfather. I struggled to find an answer that a 6-year-old could understand. "Sometimes," I told her, "people get so angry about losing that they forget how to be good. Your grandfather never forgot how to be good, even when bad things happened to him." As we stood in front of Roger's old house, Tommy put his arm around his daughter. "I want them to know who he was," he said quietly. "Not how he died, but how he lived." The new family that owned the house invited us in when they learned who we were. They'd heard the story from neighbors and wanted to show us something. In the basement, they'd found an old box that the previous owners had left behind. Inside were some of Roger's baseball cards, a few photos from his playing days, and a letter he'd written to Tommy but never sent. The letter was dated just a week before his disappearance. In it, Roger talked about how proud he was of Tommy, how he hoped his son would grow up to be kind and honest, how baseball had taught him that the most important victories were the ones that made you a better person. "Win or lose," the letter concluded, "always remember that how you play the game matters more than the final score. Be good to people, Tommy. That's the only trophy that really counts." Tommy read the letter twice before folding it carefully and putting it in his wallet. "Now I have something better than a trophy," he said. As I drove home that evening, Roger's championship trophy sitting on my passenger seat, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. A Facebook post, a fisherman's lucky find, and 28 years of questions finally answered. Roger Smith had been gone for nearly 3 decades, but his story wasn't over. It lived on in the memories of those who knew him, in the kindness he'd shown to a neighborhood kid who needed a ride to school, in the values he'd tried to pass on to his son. That night, I placed the trophy on my mantelpiece, where it catches the light from the window each morning. Sometimes my own children ask about it, and I tell them about Roger Smith, not about how his story ended, but about how he lived. About Saturday mornings and lemonade, about baseball stories and acts of kindness, about a man who understood that the most important victories happen off the field. The trophy is tarnished now, marked by its years underwater, but it still shines in its own way, just like the memory of the man who earned it, who lived with honor, and who taught us all that how you play the game matters more than whether you win or lose.